He served for 3 years in the U.S. Army, including a tour of duty in Vietnam. Attorney Churchill graduated from the University of Maine School of Law in June of 1975, cum laude, and has practiced law in Calais since being admitted to the bar in September of 1975. He is a member in good standing of the bars of the state of Maine, the federal court, and the Passamaquoddy Tribal Court. He is also a member of the board of directors of the Maine Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and a member of the Washington County Maine Bar Association. He is president of the St. Croix Historical Society, whose purpose is to preserve, protect, and promote the history of Calais through literature, public meetings, participation, and preservation. The Society operates the Holmes Cottage and the Homestead. The cottage was used as a doctor's office by Dr. Holmes, Dr. Whipple, and Dr. Cyrus Hamlin, brother of Hannibal Hamlin, President Lincoln's first vice president. And I think most of us are familiar with the St. Croix Historical Society's Facebook page, and the wonderful photographs and posts that Mr. Churchill puts on that site. So again, I'd like to welcome Mr. Churchill, who'll be talking to us about smuggling on the bay, and I think if we're local, we're familiar with that. Yeah.
You should know that most of the information he provided you came off my website, and I put it on there myself. So, believe it or not. Just curious, we're going to talk about smuggling tonight, and I see a lot of people here who are my age and Jerry's age, and how many people here have smuggled? Yeah, come on, well, let's be honest. Growing up in Calais, I mean, I was back and forth across the border with all kinds of stuff that we didn't declare. Well, actually, I have an interesting story about Canadians and smuggling. I worked for Johnson's Hardware store. Some of you may remember it was on Main Street in Calais. It was Johnson's Hardware and Sporting Goods. And back in 1964 or 65, I worked there in that era, a long time ago. And one of my jobs at Christmas time was to put bikes together. I sold a lot of bikes at Christmas time. So I'd put all these bikes together at Christmas time, and Canadians would come in to buy the bikes. And they'd say, yeah, we want to buy that bike, but would you take it apart for me? Because they were going to smuggle it back, and they could, you know, it's a lot easier to smuggle in parts than it is. And so, yeah, I mean, we know, but that kind of that kind of smuggling was, nothing compared to the industrial level of conspiracies that were going on back in 1800 and prior to that. This is a little ditty that kind of sets forth the attitude that we've always had on the border about smuggling. I got this, by the way, from an article written by your own Doug Doherty. And Doug was a great gentleman and a great historian. And whenever I had a question about anything to do with St. Stephen, I always called him. But he published some really interesting stuff, and I got this off something that he had published, and you can read it. It just, that's kind of the attitude we always had. That, smuggling wasn't any kind of criminal thing. It was just, a tradition. You did it, and you stiffed the government for a few bucks, and who cared? And anyone who actually went and paid duty was ostracized. So, but back in, after the Revolution, it was quite a bit different because, as I say, smuggling was not only a way to make a few bucks, it was a way of life, and it was the entire economy, just about, of the bay, of Passamaquoddy Bay, of Eastport and St. Andrews, who were the two major towns, and still are, on the bay. This is an early print of Eastport, and it's very, very difficult to figure out where this is taken from because this background is wrong. But that's supposed to be Eastport up on the hill there. In the early days of Eastport's existence. And here's another picture of what is, and you see the same area, the same town back here, the bay full of boats. Eastport in those days was a notorious place back after the Revolution and into the 1800s. This is a quote from Kilby. Kilby wrote a history of Eastport, which is a wonderful book. He was in his 80s when he wrote it, I think, and he wrote it in the 1880s, and he was really old when he wrote it. So he actually knew a lot of these people, the smugglers and the people the Shackfords and the people from St. Andrews. He knew all these people who he talks about in his book, and he comments that in 1812, Eastport was one of the most noted places in the country, and that's true in the United States, it was. But its fame was of the kind which no people should desire, for the general impression was that its inhabitants were bold and reckless men who earned their support by sheltering and sharing the gains of adventurers, smugglers, and gamblers, which was pretty much how everybody thought about people who lived down in Eastport. In those days, if you moved to Eastport, you were moving down to the line. That was always called down to the line, which was the boundary line. And if you were moving down to the boundary line, you were going down there to make money, doing something illicit, illegal, improper, and probably immoral by the time you got down the list. This is an older print from a New York magazine that shows someone smuggling up the river in Calais, coming across from the Canadian side to Calais. These are the revenue agents. This is later than 1800, obviously. I put this in here because this area was so notorious, and when magazines started publishing articles about, exciting things that were going on in the world, this area was pretty popular for it. And there were lots of articles in national magazines about the criminal activities and goings-on up on Passamaquoddy Bay. George Leonard, who was a superintendent in 1806, who was a superintendent of trade for New Brunswick, described the Americans as a lawless rabble, and claimed that the bay and the islands were the asylum of deserters from the British Army and Navy and of criminals and absconding debtors from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And that was about the best, apparently, he could say about us. But that was a general feeling as the character of those who were in Eastport. On the other side, of course, we had St. Andrews, where you are. This is an early print of the bay in St. Andrews. I think it's fairly accurate in terms of the geography as opposed to the Eastport ones. The comment of Davis, who wrote one of the best histories of the area, was that at this time, St. Andrews was made a port of export, and we'll get to that at some point. It became the center of illicit trade. New Brunswick papers charged that St. Andrews had become the center of an American conspiracy to violate the law. The life of customs officers had become a nightmare. These twin towns, they worked hand in glove in the smuggling. And here's a picture of your lovely town with this beautiful beach. How much stuff you could pile up on that, flour and barrels of God knows what, English furniture and china to be picked up on the Americans. I guess smuggling went both ways. It wasn't a one-way deal. Of course, this is your town down here. But so these were the two, the two main towns and the two main participants in the smuggling operation. Let me just get rid of that. And so I just threw this picture in because I like it. This is the coffee house that the Loyalists brought from Castine, I believe. Yeah. It's still down on the pier, right? It's still down there. It's a gift shop or something now. And they brought that up when they came in 1784 and put it back together. They took it apart, obviously. I also want to mention Indian Island. You folks probably know where Indian Island is. It's off down the bay some. Indian Island was a main repository of smuggled goods for a long time because it was the closest place to Eastport after you got across the line. And so if you could get to Indian Island with your stuff before either the Brits got you or the Maine people got you, then you were pretty much safe. This is the schoolhouse in Indian Island. I don't have a good old picture of Indian Island. We'll talk a little bit more about Indian Island in a few minutes. So that was the bay back in around 1800. The history of the Eastport and St. Andrews is kind of important in the two towns. because they were completely different types of people in different communities in Eastport and St. Andrews. St. Andrews was settled obviously by loyalists. They were generally more cultured, more educated. They had been successful business people and property owners, very successful, and somewhat wealthy people who had been, because of their loyalty to King George, had been driven out and ended up in St. Andrews. The folks that settled along our side of the river, especially Eastport and Calais and that part, well, rabble may be a little bit strong, but not too far off. I mean, there were a lot of frontiersmen and a lot of people who were running from the law, running from other things, running from debt, and people who just didn't like society in general and wanted to be where there were no people. And so the communities were entirely different, but they managed to come together in most situations when it came to making a livelihood smuggling. They worked hand in glove together without any problem of social status when it came to sneaking goods back and forth across the border. I'm just going to read you what Kilby, I'll read you what Kilby says about St. Andrews and Eastport at the time. He says, the loyalists who founded St. Andrews constituted what was then lacking on the other side of the river, a compact, determined community, and they were greatly embittered for what they had suffered on account of their attachment to their beloved sovereign. Among them were capable, intelligent leaders like Robert Pagan, who had been a prosperous merchant in Portland, and Thomas Wyer, the first sheriff of the county, who was an officer of customs in Old Falmouth. The county of Sudbury was separated from Nova Scotia in 1784 and erected into the province of New Brunswick, and St. Andrews made the shire town of the new county of Charlotte. The difference between the ideas of the founders of St. Andrews and those who happened to be the first occupants of Moose Island, which is Eastport, became Eastport, is characteristically shown by the marked contrast in the ways in which the two places were originally laid out. The citizens of Eastport have had frequent occasion to regret the want of foresight in their early predecessors. The Loyalists had a competent engineer, and on the hillside, sloping so pleasantly to the bay, planned the site of their future city, with broad avenues and streets crossing at right angles on the Philadelphia checkerboard pattern, while the fishermen and traders of Moose Island were content to trudge along the beaches and clamber over rocks without regular public ways, trusting to the waters of the bay for easy transportation of goods. Eastport was incorporated in 1798, and it wasn't until the following year that the first highway was laid out, which had neither courses nor distances and is of the rudest sort, indicative of the most unmethodical ways of managing public affairs. So this was High Street, and 4 years later Water Street was laid out. And apparently at that time there was an argument over whether they should make it 18 feet or 24 feet. The people who wanted it to be 18 feet wide said that all they needed was a street wide enough for two hand barrows to get by each other. That's all they cared about. And the people who wanted it to be 24 said, well, we might have horses and carriages someday. And well, they didn't have any by then. The first horse that arrived in Eastport came from John Brewer's house in Robinston and swam across the channel and apparently scared the hell out of them over there. So Eastport was a much more backward community, and as I say, St. Andrews was far more developed. But they had no problem getting together when it came to, as I say, the economic benefits of smuggling. Now, as to who caused all the problem on the Passamaquoddy Bay, I introduced you to King George. You people know King George. This is the king. He's the cause of all our trouble, you see. He had this theory that because the English had spent enormous fortunes of blood and treasure in liberating our continent from the French and the Indians and providing a safe place for the prosperity of the colonists, and we were fairly prosperous at the time, that perhaps the colonists would chip in for the many wars that he was fighting at the time on the continent with Napoleon and just about everybody. I have to say the English were either just finishing up a war, at war, or going to war with almost everybody in Europe most of the time. And it cost a lot of money. So, of course, they introduced the taxing legislation. They tried to price tea out of existence, and that was really a problem. As a result of that, things went downhill quickly. I'm not sure. This is supposed to be King George, but it doesn't look like him. But maybe when he got old, he looked like that. But he looks kind of like a pretty dastardly character there. So maybe the Americans were right about him. I don't know. And he looked like that maybe because he felt so guilty about what he was doing to the colonies. As you can see here, and this may have been it was either in an American newspaper or a British paper. There were a lot of British newspapers and people in the British public who were opposed to the war and wanted to let the colonists go. So here is Lord North was one of his lieutenants. One of these is supposed to be Lord North. This is Boston being cannonaded. This lovely lady being violated by the British, and they're pouring tea down her throat because it's probably tea on which someone hasn't paid duty. I'm not sure. And so this was a kind of, I mean, things got really pretty ugly just before the revolution started. And of course, I think the British had a point. But the colonists' theory was that they were perfectly willing to show their gratitude by sending a thank you note as long as it didn't require a statement. Things didn't work out, and they went to war, and as a result of the war, as I saw on Fox News last night, it was a result of the leadership of Donald Trump. We won the war, and you were all losers. Losers. The fact is that economically, everybody was a loser in the war because before the war, before the revolution, there was a free trade area between British North America and the United States. And we traded freely back and forth. As soon as the war was over, naturally, we were a separate country. The British had a rule for its colonies that no nation could trade with its colonies directly. In other words, you couldn't send goods from the United States to Canada and British North America. You had to send them, I guess, to Liverpool or something and then back, or someplace where the British had a customs house in order to collect the duties. So that didn't work out very well. This was devastating to the economy of the United States, obviously, and very tough over here because naturally trade needed to go on, but there was no legal way to do it. And the one place in North America where the highway, which was in those days the sea, connected and intersected with British North America and the United States was where? Passamaquoddy Bay. The only place there was. And I can tell you it didn't take people long to figure out that, especially merchants in New York and Boston and merchants in Liverpool and other places, that if you wanted to smuggle goods back and forth, this was the place to do it. Because from, as I say, from Eastport to Indian Island is about 1.5 miles. Across the bay from Robinson to St. Andrews, across the river actually, is about 1.5 miles or 2 miles. So it was this was the perfect location. So while everybody else was suffering, all of a sudden this area started to become fairly well off as a result of these smuggling operations. And the other issue we had was that the boundary hadn't been defined. When the war was over, the treaty in 1783 read as follows, that the boundary line between British North America and the United States, along here, was by a line to be drawn along the middle of the River St. Croix from its mouth in the Bay of Fundy to its source, and from its source directly north to the highlands, which divide the rivers that fall into the Atlantic Ocean from those that fall into the River St. Lawrence. Sounds easy enough, except no one knew where the St. Croix River was, and even if you knew, you didn't know where the mouth of the St. Croix River was. So there was really it was a real problem. The United States took the position, the blue line position, that the Macadavy was the St. Croix River. And that if you went up the Macadavy to its headwaters and went directly north, the United States got most of the St. Croix Valley, and the St. John Valley, up north. We got a lot more land. The Canadians say, oh, no, that's not right. The river is actually this St. Croix River, and it actually goes up here and then takes its western boundary to here, and it goes up that way and takes most of the state of Maine. So you can see we had a problem. In addition to that, the Canadians took the position, or the English took the Canadian position at that point, that all the islands in the bay belonged to Canada, including Moose Island, so there was contention. lot of contention over the boundary line, which made the lawlessness and inability to enforce any rules or laws in this area just it compounded everything else. So we were a pretty lawless area, and people argued and fought and killed each other over these boundary disputes for many, many years. As an example of this kind of thing that happened back in the 1780s and 90s, I'll just read you something from Kilby. It says, the Canadians still maintained that all the islands in Passamaquoddy Bay had originally belonged to Nova Scotia, and by the terms of the treaty still remained under British jurisdiction. And in 1785, notices were posted up on Moose Island, that's Eastport, directing the inhabitants to attend court in St. Andrews. Constables were appointed and jurors summoned, and the islanders were threatened with forfeiture of their estates unless the summonses were obeyed. But no one appeared to have heeded the threats. Finally, in December of 1785, Samuel Tuttle, the first deputy collector of customs on the island, was arrested on a pretended action of debt, and Sheriff Wire, who was one of the original settlers in St. Andrews, assured him that unless he yielded, assistance would be rendered up by an armed ship then moored at Campobello. He was taken to St. Andrews and committed to jail, but steady in his refusal to renew or acknowledge allegiance to the British Crown, he was released after 3 days of imprisonment. This is where we are today, right? Yeah. So this was the kind of situation we had on the border. I mean, the English are coming across and arresting officials that are appointed by Massachusetts as customs officers. It was the Wild East. I mean, we had the Wild West there. This was the Wild East in those days. Let's talk about the people who lived over here and who in St. Andrews who were involved in the smuggling trade, because it may surprise you if you may not. And I get this information from a treatise that some professor of history wrote. It's an amazing document. It's about 500 pages long and very well researched about this era in this area, part of the world. This person says that many of the foremost commercial figures in Charlotte County were Scots, including Robert Pagan, Colin Campbell, and his son, the McMaster family, and Christopher Scott. All belonged to the St. Andrews Society in St. John. They controlled the county's courts, the region's most advanced and productive dam and sawmill complex of St. Stephen. Scott established the area's first bank and built the St. Andrews Presbyterian Church. All of the Charlotte County Scottish merchants were well-known smugglers, included with them, including Colin Campbell, the customs officer who colluded with the smugglers. Yet the number of these Scot merchants was never very large, just a few dozen. Foremost among the Scots, and I presume in St. Andrew's history that Robert Pagan is well known in terms of being a founding father. It says foremost among the Scots and smugglers was Robert Pagan, 1750 to 1821, of St. Andrews, New Brunswick. It says Pagan emigrated to America in 1768 and established himself in Falmouth, Massachusetts. The Revolution forced him to flee, and he chose to remain as close to the American market as possible. He first established himself in Penobscot, and when the British abandoned that post, and when there, he smuggled British goods into British territory by arranging for sham capture of his vessels. When the British evacuated that post, Pagan settled in what became St. Andrews, New Brunswick, within eyesight of the American side of the border. Significantly, many of Pagan's activities were illicit in some manner. Pagan plundered crown timber reserves, illegally imported timber, sold fish to American merchants contrary to law, and actively violated the embargo. Many of his fellow merchants and countrymen pursued similar endeavors. Even in shipbuilding, Pagan and other Scots had to smuggle American ironware and Scottish copper fittings to complete their vessels. So, you know, he's your founding father, but he had his faults. And there were any of the number of other. This book has kind of biographies of lots of these people who were living on either side of the border. We could spend hours going through, and I obviously don't have that kind of time. But it's interesting. And of course, these people were the ones who were responsible for, you know, establishing and building your town. But we had equally bad characters on our side. This was the frontier, and people got away with things, and people didn't really consider it to be anything but business as usual. And on the American side, we had some. We had a guy named Jabez Mowry of Eastport, later Lubec, who specialized in importing plaster plaster was a big deal in those days. Canadians had a lot of plaster up in Nova Scotia, places like that, and it was used for fertilizer, and hundreds of tons were shipped down here, dumped on Campobello especially, and then put on smaller ships and smuggled into the United States, where it was used as fertilizer to grow crops, which were then exported back up here, because you needed our wheat and our grains and things. But anyway, Mr. Mowry specialized in importing plaster and exporting provisions. He had moved from Passamaquoddy to Rhode Island to engage in the trade. He is, from the written records, he was a central figure in Passamaquoddy struggling. His reach was transatlantic. He even shipped flour from Eastport to Calais, Spain. He had warehouses on both sides of the border to facilitate his activities. He appears frequently in court documentations, yet he remains as elusive as in death as he was in life. Apparently there were instances where they were trying to serve him with papers, and he gave them a merry chase and managed to escape in the fog back over to Campobello. And he always found a way to slip away from the authorities on both sides of the border. When the British occupied Moose Island in 1814, he continued to smuggle. And they said in order to do that, in order to run his business on Moose Island, he would dress in women's clothing when visiting Eastport during the British occupation to conduct his business. His friends, who met him at the beach to, quote, proffer the attentions due a lady, were sorely tasked to preserve their gravity as they accompanied him through the streets, because he stepped off so long and in other respects demeaned himself with so little grace and propriety as a woman, that both he and they, in spite of all hints and lessons, were objects of attention to passing persons by whom they did not wish to be recognized. So, you know, this is a couple of the type of people, one on each side of the border, who were here making vast sums of money from smuggling. One time there were 100 New York merchants smuggling actively between Eastport and St. Andrews and St. John. That's how how important this area was to the economies of both the eastern seaboard of the United States and British North America. A lot of money to be made. A lot of people made fortunes. Of course, in those days you made fortunes and you lost them. And you made them again, then you lost them. It certainly happened in Robinston and in Calais. One of the more interesting people who engaged in the smuggling trade was this fellow. Engaged in smuggling trade in the Bay. That is not other than Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold, who, even if you don't read American history, you know his history. When the word traitor is used, everyone thinks of Benedict Arnold. He was sort of a despicable fellow. He was arrogant, selfish, greedy. He spent freely without money, always in debt. His personal qualities were not great. He did, however, have a couple of qualities that endeared him to George Washington, one of which is he was an absolutely magnificent military general, and he was incredibly brave, and his men would follow him anywhere. And so Washington, and of course Washington's generals otherwise were pretty much incompetent boobs, but Benedict Arnold was actually a very good general. So Washington kept him around even though everyone else in the army wanted to get rid of him. Because he marched on Quebec. He managed to capture the cannons at Fort Ticonderoga, which they dragged back to Boston and defended the harbor during the siege of Boston. And at Saratoga, during the first day of that battle, which was a pivotal battle in the Revolution, he's almost single-handedly managed to hold the British forces back, and because the Americans were in deep trouble. And he gained such fame that day that the commanding general, General Gates, put him on the bench for the next day because the general didn't want him to get all the credit for what had happened. The second day of the battle, Arnold, disobeying orders, charged to the front, and again, through great bravery and leadership, managed to turn the battle in favor of the colonists. And so he became even less popular by the rest of most of the generals. He eventually, as Washington kept him around because he was a great general, Washington realized that he wasn't a great general, but that Arnold was, and so he needed his military expertise. As we know, he turned traitor. He was going to turn the American fort, West Point, over to the British forces, which would have been a devastating blow and cut the American forces in half. His conspirator in that fellow that came to meet him at West Point to finalize the plans was the unfortunate and brave Major Andrew of the British forces. Major Andrew slipped away, taking some very bad advice from Arnold by wearing civilian clothes when he left West Point with the instructions in his boot. When he was captured, of course, they found the instructions. He was deemed a spy because he had agreed with Arnold to wear civilian clothes instead of his uniform. And he was hanged, even though most of the people in the U.S. and the American forces did not want to hang him. His bones were finally returned to England by President Buchanan in, 1821. But anyway, so Arnold eventually escaped. Luckily for him, he managed to get on a ship and escape up through Maine, I believe, because there's a notation in Machias history where the militia was called out soon after his escape to look for him, because he was supposed to be trying to get through over the Machias area up into New Brunswick. He went off to England for a while. He was really unpopular there. Surprise. He came back and settled in St. John, and then he got himself a place in Campobello. And revolutionary hero John Allen of the colonists had purchased and settled on Dudley Island here, and he had a trading post there. And Arnold settled over in Campobello, and at a place called Snug Harbor. There's Dudley Island, and there's Snug Harbor right there. And that's where Arnold had his trading post and house. And in John Allen's records, there are references to purchases by Benedict Arnold at his trading post. And of course, he's smuggling. What he's engaging in is illegal activity, as everyone else was at that particular time. He built himself, which was there for, I don't know when it was torn down. It's not gone now, but it was. This photograph is about 1885. This is his house at Snug Harbor, and he was here for quite a long time, smuggling things back and forth, two-way traffic, as I say. There's an interesting story which I will read you about Benedict Arnold. It's kind of amazing. This guy's a traitor, the worst traitor in the history of our country, even though he was young at the time. But he's moving freely back and forth in Passamaquoddy Bay. He's trading at an American trading post operated by Colonel Allen, who was a hero of the Revolution for the Americans. And he does this without any compunction or fear, apparently, that everyone knew who he was. But you'd have thought someone would have taken him by the collar and dragged him back across to Moose Island, back to face whatever charges, and there would have been serious ones too, I can assure you. But they didn't. Anyway, here's an incident which I find very interesting. He says, Arnold loaded vessels with timber at Campobello opposite Eastport and made his headquarters at Snug Harbor. And it must have been at about this time that he had dealings with Colonel Allen. John Shackford, who was one of the original settlers of Eastport, and those of you who've been to Eastport, the Shackford Street, the Shackford Head, he's one of the Pagans. He's original settlers and people who are considered the founders of the city. John Shackford, who was one of the original settlers of Eastport, served as a soldier under Arnold in that terrible march through the Maine wilderness to the walls of Quebec. And in spite of the want of sympathy which such a staunch patriot would have had for such a traitor, always retained a kindly remembrance of him. Once when Arnold was loading a ship at Campobello, he was sent to Moose Island, Shackford was. He sent to Moose Island for men to help him in his work, and Shackford was among those who went over for that purpose. And he used to relate that when at rest after his meals, he frequently seated himself on the deck of the ship to watch the movements of his old commander, for whom courage and military skills he still retained admiration. Tears, he said, sometimes came, and I could not help myself. He carried us through everything, and I could not help thinking of him as he was then. It is not remembered whether he made himself known to Arnold at the time, and Arnold moved back to St. John in 1801. But that's kind of an interesting recollection of a Revolutionary War soldier who marched to Quebec. Anyone who knows the history of that march, is an incredible feat. He didn't win the battle, but it was just getting there was a feat. And ended up loading his Arnold's ships in Campobello. One of the original settlers of Calais was William Swain. And William Swain moved to St. Andrews, and he bought a house. And in order to buy the house, he needed a mortgage, and the mortgage holder was Benedict Arnold. Anyway, he went back to England. He is buried in St. Mary's Church at Battersea, and overlooking the Thames, and you can go see the grave. There's an interesting plaque that was obviously put up somewhat later over the grave. Here lie the bodies of Benedict Arnold, sometimes general in the army of George Washington, and of his faithful wife Margaret and their beloved daughter Sophia Matilda Phipps. It says the two nations whom he served in turn in the years of their enmity have united in enduring friendship. And there's a British flag and an American flag on it. I've never, next time I get to London, I'm stopping in to check it out. So that period of history, things changed on the bay as politics changed over and over. The smuggling of plaster, as I say, was popular in the early part of the 1802 to 1805 or 6. And in about 1806 or 7, again, the Brits were at war with a lot of people, and they had lost a lot of ships and sailors. And so they began to capture neutral ships on the high seas and seize their sailors and impress them into the British service. Well, needless to say, that aggravated the nations whose sailors were being impressed. And eventually, in 1807, Thomas Jefferson, then president, enacted the Embargo Acts. The Embargo Acts said that the United States was not going to trade with Britain, with England at all. No more trade of any kind with England. And that was really, again, devastating to all of the merchants in the United States who had a substantial trade with British North America, except for one region. You guessed it, Passamaquoddy Bay. And the smuggling became absolutely unbelievable at that particular point. The amount of smuggling that was going on. It's mostly flour, and that's superfine, this is flour. The Brits decided that, well, the best thing to do is to help them out, these smugglers. And so they opened, because the ports had never been opened, any British North American ports had not been opened to any other country's ships. But at that time, the English said, okay, the ports of St. Andrews and St. John are now open for all comers, bring your stuff. And this is a guy with a barrel of flour, and this is a British ship, because if you got out far enough from Eastport, a mile or two, and it took a while with wind, depending, it isn't something you, speedboat, it doesn't sound in no time, but in those days you had to kind of plod along. If you got close enough to the British line, British warships would protect you and take you into the harbor in St. Andrews and let you just, discharge your cargo. And there's a British ship out there waiting to help these guys out, and this guy's trying to get a barrel of flour onto the ship. We could spend a whole day just going through what was going on during the embargo years, which were 1808, almost up through the beginning of the War of 1812, where everything changed again, of course. The American producers still had all of this produce that they wanted to sell in British North America, and the British had all sorts of things that they wanted to sell to the United States, including a lot of British finished goods. The United States didn't have much industry in China and furniture and all these kinds of finished manufactured products. So they had to find a way to get them over here, and the one place to do that is Passamaquoddy Bay. So the smuggling just got completely out of hand at that point. I'll just read you a little bit about it here. At that point, Eastport became, as a consequence of its location, one of the busiest towns in the United States. In less than a month, After the embargo, large quantities of flour arrived in the harbor, and 14 vessels with full cargoes were at anchor at one time, even before the 1st of June, while Robinson was a place of destination for deposits for purchases at St. Andrews. The Little River and the neighborhood, except that every depot was within 2 or 3 miles of British territory. To that territory, owners and agents of large quantities of flour determined that their property should be transferred by fraud or by force, and there were desperate men among them. The officers of the government, this would be the U.S. government at that point, the American government, of whom there were soon a host, were arrayed in arms to defeat their purpose. I'm talking about Moose Island now. Every building, every pile of flour was guarded. Boats and barges from the vessels of war were kept constantly on the alert. While on the shore, the collector finally demanded the keys of the stores and would permit no person to enter the depositories unless in the presence of an officer. But the flour disappeared. There was indeed no such thing as keeping it here on the American side. Smugglers skulked about the rocks and hid themselves in the indentations in the shores. They had other helps, for the men who were appointed to watch their movements became, to follow common accounts, their allies and favored their unlawful enterprise. Persons who intend to measure their words have assured me, this is Mr. Kilby again, that every man in the pay of the government, 3 excepted, would take hush money, and that even these 3 would retire and go to sleep while on duty to oblige a friend. So that's how it was. And we're talking about Indian Island because that was a major destination of a lot of this. There was flour. There were a lot of things other than flour, but flour was the big item to smuggle for a long time. It says, Mr. Henderson was stationed at Indian Island. This was during the important embargo epoch. It was then that flour and other goods were boated from Eastport and landed on the island under cover of darkness. The island beaches and seawalls, which were barren at sundown, were piled high with immense heaps of goods at sunrise the next day. Collector Henderson, the collector of customs at Snug Cove, Campobello, and this is on the British side, obviously. Collector Henderson would playfully tell the men nearby, just clear away a path for me to walk through so that I won't break my legs, and that'll do. The embargo period was a period in which great wealth was accumulated on the bay. I'll take a little bit of a diversion here. This is Robinston, Joe's Point, which, by the way, was determined to be the head of the river. That's Joe's Point, not. The Canadians wanted it to be up in Devil's Head because if you drew the line from there, it went in a different direction, they got more land. But they eventually, this didn't get settled until 1843, the Ashburton Treaty. But anyway, this is Robinston, this is Joe's Point. And this is St. Andrews, obviously. Not very far across the river here. And there was an enormous amount of smuggling going on from Robinston over to Joe's Point and down in through here in the 1800s. One of the problems that they had, one of the biggest problems they had was that there was no money. People didn't have any money because what you had were coins issued by various countries. And they were, if it was gold, they were pure gold. If it was silver, they were pure silver. They were in species, whatever weight they had in their value. But there was very little of it around. And if you smuggled $20,000 worth of flour over to St. Andrews and only got $10,000 worth of furniture to smuggle back, you wanted $10,000 in species or something to compensate you. And it became a serious problem. But of course, whenever there's a problem, there's a solution. And that's a Spanish doubloon. They had some American half dollars and quarter dollars, and then Spanish escudos. Those were the coins that were on the border. But what was happening? In order to grease the trade, a number of enterprising people decided that they would make their own money. And they were counterfeiters, obviously. They were called coiners at the time, not counterfeiters. It was a capital crime, by the way, at the time, to be a coiner or a counterfeiter. And one such person, and in fact the most notorious of all, this is Robinston. This is the Mansion House. If you come around the corner of that big house in Robinston, the Mansion House, and this is the Red Beach. And right up here, there was a fellow named Ebenezer Ball. He was from Deer Island. He came over here with his wife. He had a couple kids. And he also managed somehow to get a stamp and a mold for one of those, I think it was one of these coins, that one. And professionally made, obviously. And what they would do is they would use their mold, and they would mold a piece of pewter, the exact size of that coin. And then they would dip it in real gold. And then using their stamp, they would stamp the impression on the coin. And Ebenezer's confederate was a fellow from St. Andrews. And of course, it didn't take long for people to figure out that a lot of the money they were getting was only just, brushed with gold. It wasn't real gold. And so there was a lot of this stuff around, and people were getting pretty upset about it. And Ebenezer Ball and his compatriot did this work out at Moneymaker Lake. This is Robinston, this is Red Beach. The little lake, here's Moneymaker Lake. Of course, it wasn't called Moneymaker Lake then, but it became Moneymaker Lake. Because at about the time of the embargo, Ebenezer and his confederate were out making some nice coins out there. And Sam Jones, a surveyor from Robinston, happened to stumble upon the operation. And there was some conversation back and forth, some allegation that they were paid off not to say anything, but they did. They eventually told the authorities, and at that point, a warrant for Ebenezer's and his Confederates' arrest was issued from Calais, believe it or not, by the Justice of the Peace, Stephen Brewer. And my only theory as to why that was happening, why it happened in Calais and not Eastport or Robinston, is that the people in Robinston and Eastport didn't want the coiners to be stopped because there was too much money being made, and they didn't want anyone interrupting their enterprise. But anyway, so he issues a warrant, and they hire this guy named John Downs. They just deputized him to come down and arrest Ebenezer. So they come down with 2 or 3 people from Calais, and they get Ebenezer, and they drag him down to the mansion house, which is still there in Robinston, the most beautiful house in Robinston, where Stephen Brewer's brother, John Brewer, it was his house, and they were justices of the peace, and they drag Ebenezer down, and they have the warrant from Calais, and they accuse him of this crime, which he denies it, of course. And the magistrates, there were 2 of them, there was John Brewer and another magistrate, when they read the warrant over, they see that the warrant is based on hearsay. That Sam Jones didn't actually tell the Calais Justice of the Peace. It was only he apparently had written something out and it had been given to him. So he hadn't testified in person before the Justice of the Peace. So the 2 people at the Brewer House, who were the local JPs, said, we're not going to arrest Mr. Ball because Mr. Brewer has not personally sworn that this is the truth. So they let Ebenezer go. Ebenezer lives just up the road a quarter of a mile. The next day, Sam Jones shows up at the mansion house, and the 2 justices of the peace, John Brewer and the other one, come back and they question him, and he swears that personally he saw them coining. So they contact Calais again, and John Downs comes back again, Sheriff Downs with a group of people from Calais to arrest Ebenezer Ball. And they leave from the mansion house and they start walking up the road. It wasn't much of a road in those days, but they walk up the road, and Ebenezer's outside chopping wood. He sees them coming. He disappears in the house, and he comes out with his musket and another small firearm and starts walking away from them up the road. They get close enough to have conversation. They ask him where he's going. He says, well, I'm going gunning. Gunning means hunting in those days. And eventually they say, well, no, you better come with us. And he starts to walk faster. They walk faster. He finally leaves the road and heads into the woods, or tries to head into the woods along a trail, and they're close behind him at that point. And someone yells at him to stop. He turned around, and in turning around, it's fairly clear that the musket he had, which was charged, probably struck a bough and discharged and shot John Downs in the stomach. They take John Downs, Sheriff Downs, back to the mansion house, put him in bed there for 2 days, where he expires in very excruciating pain, but he dies, and they charge Ebenezer Ball with murder. Well, in fact, it wasn't murder, it was manslaughter. In those days, the penalty for manslaughter was 4 years. The penalty for murder was hanging. So it's a pretty important distinction to Ebenezer. You can believe that. But they wanted to make an example of Ebenezer. So they drag him off to Castine and have a trial at which he is not allowed to testify, nor are any witnesses of his allowed to testify. And they convict Ebenezer Ball of murdering Sheriff Downs. And Ebenezer, unfortunately, there he is. It's the end of Ebenezer. They hanged him. So, in addition to, making money smuggling goods back and forth, there were a lot of cottage industries like coining that went along with it. Over here, let me make it quick. I don't want to keep you guys here all night. The War of 1812 arrives. You've had a recent celebration. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we had celebrations, and so most people know the causes of the War of 1812 was again the impressment, and there were economic reasons for it. The president at the time, James Madison, said, we got to stop all the smuggling up on Passamaquoddy Bay. It's a terrible thing, and they made an attempt to do that. Very unsuccessful. Fort Sullivan was built, and there was a large number of U.S. troops there, but it didn't stop. It didn't stop the smuggling. If anything, it was just as bad during the period of the war. And this is a situation where, theoretically, the people of St. Andrews were at war with the people in Moose Island and Eastport, but they decided to declare a truce. They weren't going to, not only weren't they going to fight with one another, they were going to cooperate as best they possibly could in keeping the smuggling business going, and they were very successful in that. They continued all throughout the War of 1812 to smuggle vast quantities of goods back and forth across the bay, and it was the main industry of this area. And it went on long after. I mean, it went on. We joke about us smuggling stuff back and forth, but major smuggling continued on the river, and to some extent it moved upriver. From 1812 to 1814, the British did not take Eastport. I mean, it left it alone, other than to try to keep the smugglers from violating their territory. But in 1814, they captured Moose Island, and this is a certificate of Corporal Blackman. I guess you got a certificate as opposed to being paid, I expect. If you were in on the capture of Moose Island. Oh, and the other thing I just mentioned briefly. When the war started, and especially after the capture of Moose Island by the English, the privateers came out. The privateers were just ships from both sides who would capture any ship of the other country and claim it as a prize and sell it with whatever goods that were on it. This is in the Grand Manan Museum. This shows an American privateer in the Grand Manan Harbor and capturing this ship, and there's a story, the ship Sally is a story about it. That's kind of interesting. But the privateers roamed up and down the coast and captured tens of thousands of dollars worth of ships, and some of them worth a lot of money, probably millions even in those days. It was big business, and the privateers came from all over the coast of Maine. The ships were outfitted in Saco and Portland and Falmouth. And most of them weren't local. They were from down the coast further. And they came up here, and they would raid St. Andrews. And at one point, they had a bunch of ships that were going to raid St. Andrews. The people in St. Andrews let it be known that if they did raid St. Andrews, the people in St. Andrews were going to come burn Eastport. So, I mean, things did get testy on occasion during this period. Although people were still making lots of money, and the community was still pretty much cohesive. And of course, later on, this is another one of these things from the New York magazines, Prohibition. Prohibition was, Maine enacted the first prohibition laws in the country in 1882, I think. So we were the first place, the first state area to have prohibition. And of course, the Canadian, you folks didn't have prohibition. So there's lots of booze over here, and so we were buying and smuggling enormous quantities of alcohol back and forth across the river. And this is, Frank Leslie's illustrated paper, and this is a smugglers' headquarters near Calais. It looks like they're drinking their product. I don't know what they're doing. Later on, of course, lumber the lumber industry. This is in Calais, below Knight's Corner. This is the American side. This is the Canadian side. And the mills went right across the river. And so they would take Canadian lumber, bring it down, process it at their mill on the Canadian side, and then bring it right across the U.S. side, claim it was processed in one of the mills on the U.S. side, and sell it without any export duties or taxes or anything. And in fact, in 1887 or 8, there was an article in the New York Times, a very long article. Today we would consider it an investigative reporter's article. It was an expose of smuggling in Calais and Milltown. And naming the Todds, the Murchys, the Eatons, all of the people who were smuggling, pointing out that there were mills on the Canadian side of the river that were claimed to be on U.S. property. And they were paying taxes to Calais. And so obviously the municipal officials were all involved in it too. And this just shows you, this is the cotton mill. If people remember the cotton mill, that's the edge of the cotton mill right there. And these are all mills. This is the American side. You can see all the lumber and all the mills. And I'm willing to bet you that every bit of this lumber was declared to be U.S. lumber and sold as U.S. lumber without taxes, without export duties. So, we hung on to smuggling for a long time as a profitable way of making money and making a living. And not so much today, obviously. Things have changed a great deal. But for at least 125 or 30 years, it was the major industry in the St. Croix Valley and certainly in Penobscot Bay. That's all I know. Smuggling.
I'd like to thank you, Mr. Churchill, for our integrated economy from the past. And maybe with the lumber dispute that we're now going through, we could go back to those.
Maybe.
We'll have to see what happens with NAFTA. And
some things never change.
That's right.
I mean,
revive that particular.
We'll have to start smuggling again.
That's right.
Yeah.
I was fascinated when I thought about Benedict Arnold, the word traitor and traitor, as in a military sense and as
Yes,
in traitor of goods and so on. So he was both.
And as I say, when I read the history, I was so shocked that he moved so freely in American territory after the war, given the fact that the authorities were desperate to get their hands on him. But people up here, we were so far away from everything. I mean, the government in Washington was just a notion to people. They didn't know what they, And that was the reason it was so easy to smuggle and why people didn't really care that no one was paying duty. Well, thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
All right, it's a little gift on the other side.